Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is the show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Specification Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Brian Jonas, AIA, Lead AP BD+C, Principal Owner at Graham Baba Architects in Seattle, Washington. Brian has over 25 years of experience in a broad range of project sizes and types. He is as excited by the big idea of a project as he is by the smallest detail and particularly enjoys guiding clients through the design and construction processes. Brian has expertise in branding and institutional identity, high-performance building envelopes, energy efficiency, and design detailing practices. He guides some of the firm's most complex projects, often for larger client groups with more significant program requirements and more robust management needs. The project we are talking about today is the amazing Ballard Food Bank, also in Seattle. The Ballard Food Bank has been a lifeline for its community since its founding in the late 70s, steadily growing and evolving to support Ballard's most vulnerable residents. Once focused solely on providing food, the food bank now offers comprehensive social and medical services in collaboration with community partners. As the demand for their services grew, the food bank set out to establish a permanent welcoming home that would fully support its mission, transforming an abandoned brownfield site into a vibrant community resource. This is the coolest food bank that I have ever seen. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Brian Jonas, AIA, Lead AP BD+C, I love those, Principal/owner at Graham Baba Architects in Seattle, Washington. Graham Baba's third appearance on the show. Always love to have the firm back. The project we are talking about today is the Ballard Food Bank, also in Seattle. Brian, welcome. How
Thank you.
are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. The sun's poked out, so we're feeling very lucky here.
I saw, I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Oh,
Yeah, so I get it. Usually we have similar weather, and I thought I saw a little sunshine through the blinds, and it's soccer game tonight, Timbers soccer game tonight. So I'm really hoping for at least dry weather, if nothing else. So I always start every episode with some icebreaker question that I make up out of wherever to kind of warm us up and get us going. So for you today, I would like to know, what piece of advice would you give your 16-year-old self?
oh wow, my 16-year-old self. That, without giving too much away, that is a long time ago.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have advice for my 16-year-old self, but I wouldn't mind giving my 16-year-old self some advice to use for when I was a young architect. And I think it's mostly, in those early years, I took everything so very seriously. Every decision was fraud. Everything had equal weight. And I wish my younger self took it a little less seriously, maybe, or took it a little less personally, and kind of gave the grace to the process that it needs. Um, the flip side to that is I find myself as a more mature architect now, doing that, but sometimes maybe I take that too far, and I've got all these crazy, young, talented people who I look at and see myself as a younger person, and they remind me when I should be like, no, that's not okay, right, and push harder. So there's a nice balance there. But I think I lost a lot of this hair when I was a younger architect, over being maybe too nervous about some of the every last little small thing.
I love that. I look at some of these questions I make up for my guests, and I force myself to answer them as well. And I think mine for me at 16 would be to never let fear stand in your way. And I tell that, I do a lot of mentoring. I tell that to a lot of young professionals because I can look back and see opportunities that I may have missed out on for fear that I wouldn't be perfect at it the first time out. I like to do my job well, no matter what it is. And this job and this industry is all about failing up. I mean, this job is, you don't learn in this industry if you don't fail and then figure out how to fix it. So I love that. I love your answer because it really is. You have to have a sense of humor and you have to take a deep breath and realize that not everything's going to work the first time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So let's talk about this project. I actually just posted this on Twitter 5 minutes before I logged in. I will never call it X. It will always be Twitter.
Fair.
That I love doing interviews about projects that do good things. They touch me in a different way. And so let's start with a little background on this client, who they are, what did they have, and what did they need?
Okay. So the client is the Ballard Food Bank. It's also the name we gave the project. They're a nonprofit organization, private non-for-profit that existed since the early 70s. Been through several evolutions as an organization. They're named after the neighborhood in which they were located and are still located in Northwest Seattle, but they serve kind of greater Northwest Seattle. And there's a distinction we can get into later about how the federal government used to allocate food funding and how they don't now. So now they broadly serve the city in some way. When they came to us in 2019, they were in a space they had been in since 2001, I believe, which was a Butler building kind of close to downtown Ballard. And when they first moved in, and I think it's when I was first here, that part of the city was, where you got your car repaired. It was sort of, it was some light industrial related to the fishing industry. And between then and when they were coming to us, it had just ballooned into this huge entertainment and nightlife district. And so they were renting. Their rent was about to go up. There were other companies vying for the space, and they recognized that they were going to lose that lease. And so they set about to find a piece of land where they can kind of build their forever home, so that wouldn't happen again. And they found this piece of land. It's 6 blocks away, but as you know, in urban areas, that's a world away. And so it was in more of a kind of a mixed industrial neighborhood that is now actually gentrifying as well, but they own the land. And what was pretty great about them as a client is that they had this executive director, Jen Muzet, who had been with the organization for a while, and she just did this amazing job cultivating a board and cultivating a staff that had the wherewithal to understand that this was an important inflection point in the organization. They weren't just building a home, right? They were saying something new about themselves. And so they'd done all this amazing hard work about who they were, what their values were. And they came to us with a site. They came to us with a budget. They came to us with a development manager who was going to help them. And they came to us with an updated set of value statements and mission and vision. And, I think about how many clients we have that don't have that. And it's really hard to create a building that's going to reflect who the organization is if they don't know who they are. So they kind of came to us with that. And their issue was largely, we're going to build a new home here. Help us understand what's going to go on that home and then ultimately what the building would look like.
That is really unique for a nonprofit. I've worked with a number of nonprofits over the years, and my mother used to have one. When you're sitting there telling me that, they came to the table with all these things already, started and some of these things figured out, like a site, that is a testament to the director.
Yeah, 100%.
It really is. That's incredible because nonprofits are not always super easy to work with, and not so much about the people, but there's just so many challenges involved in trying to get what they need for what is typically very limited funds.
I mean, we have very sophisticated private clients that do not come to the table with this. So it really gave us something to grab onto to start the project.
Well, that already helps to start explain why this project. I'm not looking at email, I'm looking at pictures of your project over here. Why it's so fantastic. Because I'm an organizational freak, seriously. And the more organized you are and the more you cross all those T's and dot all those I's, the better the end product is. I firmly believe that. So, community serving agencies typically have a lot of different players involved, a lot of different kind of hands in the pie, so to speak. What did the planning and programming process look like with this group, with you guys?
Yeah. So we did do a pretty extensive pre-design process. And, they came to us with those mission and value statements. They obviously had the site, and they had a program, but the program, as you've probably seen this with clients, the program was basically a bullet point list of 9, 10 things they thought they wanted in the space and not much more. And so there were a couple aspects of this sort of phase that lasted 3 or 4 months. And like the first one was just literally looking at the site, where is it? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? It was a brownfield site, although it had been, most of the contamination had been addressed and capped, but it was, an empty gravel site. It sat on a major road that traversed part of North Seattle, and then a side street that um, would generally be called a boulevard in its configuration, but was mostly asphalt, right?
Mm.
Um, and so, we looked at that. We understood there was industrial zoning in the city of Seattle is actually fairly unique in terms of parking and stormwater requirements. So we understood that. So we did that piece that all architects do, right? When they look at a site. I think the final challenge there was that at the time, light rail expansion was planned for that neighborhood, and there was one route that was planned to go right adjacent to our building. So we were trying to understand what that would do as well. So there was that kind of stuff. And then we did programming, right? So we took those bullet point lists and we began to expand upon them, working with the director, with staff, um, with some of their volunteers. Interesting. Some of their volunteers are also board members. Some of their volunteers are also clients. And so it's this really interesting mix of people with different perspectives and fleshing out those spaces, like what each of those would be, how big should they be, what should they do. And, when you work with clients, you start with your wish list. And then, we add a grossing factor to kind of account for the circulation and the mechanical spaces that they're not thinking about. And you get to a approximate size of the building. And that size is a proxy for budget, right? So the biggest thing you can do up front is to control the size of the building to make sure that you're controlling the size of the budget. And they started with, I know it was like 18,000 square feet. And what they really could afford was 12. So we were able to work with them to kind of begin to right size some of those spaces, begin to think about dual use spaces. Do you need a dedicated board, room, right? Well, maybe not. And so we're able to get them down to 12,000 square feet. So there was that kind of product that came out. And then the last thing we wanted to do during this phase was to take those value statements they had put together and try to build a shared language amongst us and then all their stakeholders about what it would mean to translate that into architecture. Like, how do we communicate their values to the people that they're going to serve into the community? And so, as an example, I think one of the values was, we are a civic organization. And you think about what civic could mean, right? Well, civic could mean in architecture, First Federalist United States Bank of America. It's this very formal Greek temple, and that communicates civic, as does many state capitals, right? But so would a glass pavilion in a park with a door that opens wide open. And so we kind of went through this visual exercise to develop that shared visual language, and we wanted to do that before we started designing. So we kind of came out of it with that as well. And, there were 5 or 6 different value statements that I don't remember all of them now, but, that we sort of applied the similar thinking to kind of then develop this, like, mix them all together and like, well, this is kind of an approximation of your values. And not in our words exactly, but in other architecture.
So tell me about that design vision for this project. Once you went through all of that with them, what were you starting to flesh out in your process on the architecture side of what this building would look like?
Yeah. So I think the first path was now taking this program, um, and literally thinking like, how does this fit on a site in a single story building? Because again, that's what they could afford, right? And I think at that point, an elevator or a stair was kind of, from a circulation standpoint, out of the equation. So we probably looked at, I don't know, a dozen and a half different configurations. And we ultimately landed at, it's not, maybe a little more than a bubble diagram, right? But we ultimately landed at a program where we sat an entry off of the side street. And that was an interesting choice on their part because they wanted to feel welcoming and they don't want there to be sort of shame associated with that you're being served here. But at the same time, um, a number of their clients have a sensitivity to asking for help. I think everyone should feel like they should be able to ask for help, but I think some of our clients, and it's understandable, they feel nervous about asking for help. So they didn't want to be on display, right? So it's on the side street. There's a welcoming garden space. You come into this main central space, and then to one side is the cafe. We can get into these spaces later, but one side is a cafe. The other side is a social services hub. Straight ahead is the market proper, the supermarket proper. Attached to that is the warehouse. And then sort of tucked in the leftover corner are their offices, right? And so that was the ultimate solution, but there were, a dozen others, right? And then parking and loading were on a secondary side street on the back of the site. And so we kind of landed on that. And then there was this sort of process really early on where we sort of, I sat down with a roller trace and a little 3D base axon and really tried to understand at a diagrammatic level, how would we communicate the architecture, right? And these are drawings, and I'm sorry for your audio listeners that I'm holding my fingers up, like maybe a 3-inch by 2-inch diagram, right? That if it's legible at that level, then it's going to be legible, and you can carry it all the way through. And so I went through, a couple dozen, and then we sort of narrowed it down to 3 or 4, and then the team pulled the team in, this very talented team who was able to kind of translate that into a little bit of more architecture, right? And then we presented that to the client, and we had our favorite, which I was so glad that I tried not to put my thumb on the scale, but like they ultimately decided that was their favorite as well. Um, and you see it in the final building, and I wish maybe we can send you the sketch, but because we have it, the idea was that along the side street where you entered, there'd be this lower volume series of sort of seesaw gable spaces that would have these more intimate scaled spaces, more welcoming. And then on the second half of the site, maybe it's like maybe more like 60-40. So that was 60% running from the main street back was the market and the warehouse. Very efficient sort of box, right? That it was meant to be as few columns as possible, as efficient as possible, as flexible as possible. And you look at that diagram and, it's one of those things where you look at the finished product and like, there it is. Right. And so I think that was an interesting genesis for us and then building consensus around that so that I'm not going to say we pulled out that little piece of trace every time we made a decision, but you could begin to understand the decision making around that.
So let's start getting into more specifics, starting with the site. So you briefly mentioned it earlier, but I understand this is a brownfield site. And I'm always interested. I've worked on a few of those over, not giving too much away, I won't say how long, over the course of my career. And I know there's obviously typically some unique needs. Tell our listeners, in case we have some that don't know what a brownfield site is, what a brownfield site is and what you did to mitigate it beyond what apparently it sounds like was already done to the site.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm probably going to botch this because I'm not an environmental engineer, but I'll do my best from an architect's perspective what a brownfield site is, which is a either currently contaminated or formerly contaminated site, which is feasible to put into reuse, right? So this is not the Hanford nuclear reservation. This is a site that probably had, I think it was a series of oil tank leaks or, maybe dry cleaning chemicals. I can't remember what the contamination was. And so the majority of the remediation to a no action letter from the state was done by the time we showed up. And so, um, I know we mentioned it's a brownfield site. I guess our challenge was less that it was a brownfield site and more that it was kind of a degraded site. So this was when we got it, was chain link razor wire fence around, 4-inch plus minus gravel on the whole thing. The street edge was mostly concrete, patches of weeds, right? And so I think the challenge there was to turn this space into something that felt more welcoming, felt more civic. And so obviously the building ended up occupying a good chunk of the site within the property boundaries. And then, it's interesting. We did our pre-design without civil and landscape, and we brought them at the being a schematic design, and they said, "Where's your stormwater infrastructure?" I'm like, "What?" And they started calculating how much space we would need on the site for rainwater gardens. Um, and every single roof surface, every single parking surface goes to a rainwater garden. So we put those in, and then we squeezed in the zoning required parking. And there's a little bit space left we can talk about later, but then we basically squeezed the building in around it. We sort of joked that we were designing the building to fit the stormwater infrastructure, not the other way around. But that fit in. But then we had this whole street frontage, which in the city of Seattle, when you do a major development, you're required to redevelop the public right away. And it's kind of how the city, without spending public funds, is able to kind of create a better public environment. And so, there's a minimum you could have done, but we did a lot more. I should mention Hewitt Landscape Architects. They were our landscape architect, and they took this challenge very seriously, and they ended up really building this quite lush and lovely streetscape that ended up setting the tone for the more expensive private developers going north. That we were able to kind of say this is an important civic space, it's an important intersection. So I think that for us was important to do, setting aside whatever we did with the building.
So going down my first rabbit hole, these rate
Fair.
this store, yeah, I can't ever stick to the entire script perfectly. These rainwater gardens in the stormwater requirements there, is that something you chose to do? I know Seattle's has some stricter requirements in a lot of places. Is that something that's required in order to be able to build there?
Yeah. As I understood it, yes. The more subtle answer, if I asked our civil engineer, might be that, well, theoretically, you could do a giant tank underground, but it would have been prohibitively expensive. But my understanding is, yeah, well, one, there was a requirement that we can't simply tightline our stormwater to the street system. Like there is a requirement for retention on site. Not so much treatment, although these stormwater gardens do filter out a lot of the pollutants, but I think it was mostly about retention in a major storm event that we weren't immediately dumping. So I know there was a requirement that every bit of rainwater went to these stormwater gardens. And so there's one stormwater garden in the parking lot that accepts the whole plane had to be not only dressing our sidewalks and our building, but also getting the water to kind of warp into that space. Um, and then there are a series of other gardens that when you look at photographs, you can kind of make it out where every single roof surface we had to somehow get to those places, right? And there was limited places where we could bring them. And so it was really interesting challenge within the building even to kind of begin to route a lot of that stormwater, that roof water to those spots. And you'll see around the building, sometimes there's a cow tongue, sometimes there's a cow tongue that leads to a runnel that goes across a certain zone to get to a garden. Along the front, there's this kind of front series of like a downspout comes down to a runnel to another downspout. And so we were able to be a little playful with it too. Once we sort of said, well, we have to do this, let's make something of it. And I think on the project in general, as we get more into it, a lot of the things that we had to do, we tried to say, okay, that's our opportunity to make architecture here because we can't, with this budget and this client, we can't be gratuitous about the design.
Well, I love that too, because I don't know how many times when there's a requirement and it's not something maybe an architect really wants to have, but you have to meet it, they just slap it on the building and call it good instead of finding a way to work that into that aesthetic or vibe or look that you're looking for. So I love that you did that. So what are some of the features? You've touched on a couple here. What are some of the features in the site that are there outside of the building?
It's interesting. In the city of Seattle, there's precious few zoning areas where parking is even required anymore. But in an industrial zone, you are. And we were able to work collaboratively with the city to kind of come up with a reasonably creative solution to how we would calculate those so we wouldn't overwhelm the site. So we've got some parking. There's a large loading area, and we'll get into later the kind of efficiency required because they're bringing not only their own trucks in, but volunteers drop off food. They have, distributors come, various supermarkets drop off food. So that'd be super efficient. We've obviously got our improved streetscape, which is a series of, wouldn't call them gardens, but kind of fairly lushly planted spaces, new street trees, a lot of seating, you know. Well, one of the unfortunate facts of a food bank, the life of a food bank, is there's a lot of waiting, right? And this food bank, the hope was is that we'd eliminate the waiting by making it bigger, and which ended up happening is they had more patrons. So on any given day, there's a lot of people waiting around. So a lot of generous outdoor seating. And then the one little fun thing I think I mentioned before that after we put the parking in and a stormwater and put the building in, there was like one little spot left. And the food bank had this on their wish list, not so much on their required list, but a wish list to have a small productive garden. And so Hewitt was able to come up with a relatively inexpensive way of creating raised planters, a relatively inexpensive way of putting irrigation together. And they have this garden that they use it mostly for education. And this was actually a lesson. It's interesting. It's a lesson we learned from one of the projects that actually landed us at the food bank's doorstep was a rebrand and a series of designs we had done for PCC Natural Markets, now PCC Community Markets, which is a big local co-op. They have like a dozen stores. And we had talked to them about actually in their Ballard location, a rooftop garden. And we said, listen, great, you guys can grow lettuce and sell it in the store. And they stopped me and they said, Brian, whatever crop we could get from, 100 square feet of lettuce gardening would be gone in an hour and a half in the store. And it was a reminder that like, oh, the kind of, the level of production we have in our agricultural system required to feed people is immense. Like we shouldn't kid ourselves. And so, the food bank understood that, but they're not necessarily using that garden to like fill the store. But it's more about educating clients how to grow their own food. And it also does allow them to fill in some stuff. Like, so if they're having trouble getting a certain herb that a community wants, they can grow that there, or like a certain kind of garlic. So, but that was fun, and it's still super active, and they use it all the time, and they're very proud of it.
Yeah, it's a totally different facility. I was raised by a single mom, and we had some struggles when I was a kid where we had to utilize food banks. And I took one look at it. So this is one of the reasons this project particularly touched me.
Mhm.
I love that you put that entrance not on display because I know exactly what that feels like. And just the touches here to make it a place where people are not ashamed to go, which we're going to talk about more as we get into the interior or get into the building itself.
Mhm.
But I love everything I see. I really do. I think that lifting people up only helps them get to a place where hopefully at some point they don't have to come here, um, and don't need that help. But tearing them down doesn't do that. So let's start talking about the building. So you've already given me a broad description of the building's components and the spaces, just broadly. So let's just get into that in a little more detail before we start narrowing it down into really specific things. Like specifically, what are the spaces that are now inside this building, and kind of just a broad, what does that look like? Paint me a picture.
Yeah. So it's sort of broadly what we discussed before relative to the diagram, right? So there is that front entry off the side street. Curiously, how that garden is set up was governed by stormwater. So there's a raised stormwater planter, which also allows us to have some kind of greenery that you see from inside the space. Um, but you enter through a vestibule there as a pergola structure that was, we'll get into later, but we enter through that into this main volume that is sort of a single space that is the cafe and the welcome desk. And there's a welcome desk there, and where you're greeted. You may already know your way around, but it's where you check in. It's where you're say, okay, you can go over there for this, you can go over there for that. It is again a fact of food bank existence that there's some waiting around, so there's generous amount of seating. And then the cafe that's to the left was intended to be that kind of overflow for that seating, but also a place where you could literally get a meal. And we'll get into a little bit more of that program and how that evolved and what they're doing with it now that we didn't really quite envision at the time. And then off of that, they have a series of doors. They can close it off if they want, but it opens wide open to, they call it their hub, and it's where their partner organizations come in to provide social services. So there might be a vet that comes in, once every 2 weeks, take care of the client's pets. You can have your mail delivered there if you don't have a place to have your mail delivered, right? There's a place where you can use a computer to sign up for certain things or check email. Doctors might come in, a therapist might come in. So that's sort of that zone. And then straight ahead from that entry are a series of doors that lead you into that supermarket itself. And we can get into that later. Off of that is the warehouse space that services that in a kind of efficient way, has a few other back of house spaces. And then kind of tucked in the last little corner, kind of behind that hub when you first walked in, are the offices, because obviously they need a set of spaces for the people who actually are running the whole show here, need a dignified place to work as well. And I think that's important when we think about this, right? Is that often we think, well, you work for a not for profit, this shouldn't be fancy either. And it wasn't so much that we made it fancy, but we made it a place that people would feel good working in. And I think that was important as well. So those are the kind of series of spaces in a nutshell. There's smaller little rooms within each of those that we can get into later if you want, and obviously the character of those. But that's fundamentally what's there.
Yeah, I hope you're blasting this everywhere so everybody can see what they could do. I do a fair amount of volunteering and have volunteered at a local food bank to put food boxes together and things like that. And I have all the respect in the world for these people and what they do year round. But that place was this cold warehouse, little tiny, probably not very functional offices. It wasn't this, so this is amazing. The project information says this building was structured around two basic ideas. The first, the design efforts must create an inclusive, humane, and dignified space. And the second, that the building must also efficiently and safely maximize the food bank's ability to meet its mission so that it can reach as many of those in need as possible. Can you give me a couple of examples of what you did in this project to meet those ideas?
Yeah. So those two ideas started a little simpler in our minds when we started, and was sort of the efficiency side of it was the journey of the food, and the sort of the empathy, the dignity started as the journey of the person, right? And so I'll start with maybe the simpler one to maybe understand is the journey of the food, right? Which is, these food banks, they're getting donations from all sorts of different places. They have some staff that run in that warehouse, but they're mostly volunteer run. Volunteers fuel that, right? And they have a lot of clients with needs, right? And so, our experience having worked on other retail projects, we've done a lot of maker things. Like I think you've interviewed a former colleague of mine about a whiskey production place. We've done coffee. We understand there's efficiencies to how these things happen that in the private sector mean dollars, and that here really more translate to food banks got a fixed amount of donations that on a given day, they've got a fixed amount of volunteer labor. And so if it takes a volunteer twice as long to get the food in the door, into the warehouse shelves, into the supermarket, for the clients, it takes twice as long to get it out the door. It means they're serving half the number of clients, right? Like it's
Right.
just a fact of life. So we had to pay care and attention to that. And that really kind of came down to, leaning into some of our retail and food service experience to kind of understand how the food would move through, keeping an efficient warehouse space, making sure we understood the movements from the truck to the warehouse shelving to the walk-in cooler or freezer, and then how you might stock shelves, right? Like if you look at that supermarket, um, it it's designed like a supermarket, right? So the shelving, we sort of walk the client into using very standard supermarket shelving. It's not Metro Rack, which a lot of these food banks have, right? It's standard supermarket shelving that has no divider, right? So even that fact that you begin to stack your stuff up, your cans of tomatoes stop where the cans of tomatoes stop. They don't have to be reorganized every time you do something, right? So it's even stuff like that made that all more efficient, right? Um, on the journey of the people, I think, um, I think for us, it, we're not food bank architects per se. Like we're actually working on another one now, that's in construction documents, but really we design just about everything. Like, I mean, we've done whiskey warehouses, but we do a lot of food and bev. We do a lot of ground up new construction. We do very high end corporate tech campuses. It's sort of all over the map. And I think for us, it was important that we had that experience, like to create a supermarket for someone in need. You should know what it means to design a supermarket, to design a cafe for someone in need. You should know what it means to design a cafe, right? And so I think having that experience and why the food bank came to us was that experience, um, was important for us at every step of the way, that we think of this in those terms of what anywhere else in the city would feel like, right? Because these are people that are, and I think out the spaces these clients are often shunted into, um, it's some of the worst space in the city, and that does not fly, right? Like we want to give everyone an experience, no matter who they are, no matter why they're there that week, um, because you and I someday knock on something, and I won't because I don't want to ruin the audio on the podcast, um, but we could be there too. And so I think having that empathy around that and creating a space that would feel good for just about anyone to come in was important to us.
You really do have, I don't think I really thought about it this way until you just said what you said, but you have a number of project types all rolled into one in this building. The cafe and the food and beverage and the grocery store and offices and warehouse space. And then, those community spaces where they can have the therapy or the doctor. Um, yeah, you would have to, if you didn't have that experience to draw on, I could see how a project like this could go terribly wrong. It, all the best intentions, but not understanding how all those different types of spaces work uh, could be detrimental. Something tells me you'll be doing more than a few food banks. So let's get into some design components. Let's start with the building, the actual exterior of the building itself. Tell me what you designed there and some of the materials you used on the exterior, the enclosure of the building.
Yeah. So if you remember the little tiny 3-inch diagram, right, that had the seesaw roof on one side and the other building on the other side, I think what was interesting is we initially thought that, the seesaw roof is clearly, it's a wood frame structure. It's relatively economical. The scale is right. The construction type works with building code. That was going to be great. And then, I mean, we've done large maker spaces. We've designed some warehouses, but we're not warehouse people. And so we naively said, well, we're going to do tilt up concrete for the market section. Aren't we smart? That's going to work perfectly here. And we can make it beautiful and all that kind of proportions, right? And you know, the food bank was also smart, and they brought a contractor in early. It was Wilcox Construction, who we actually have collaborated with quite a bit. They're great contractors, and we had a really smart PM and an owner and a super. They took one look at it and said, I mean, they were very nice about it. They were like, "Oh, their architect. Tilt up won't work on this site, right?" And they reminded us that, oh yeah, to do tilt up architecture, you need to have enough space around the whole building that you can pour the panels on and lift them up. You can't just like pour them someplace, lift them up, crane them over, and move them around to the other side of the site. And they also said, and also besides the fact, like for a building of this scale and size, you should just wood frame it anyway. It's gonna be less expensive. So, so we got to this place where the underlying structure for these two different components is very similar. Um, I will say that, the main warehouse, we were using much longer members. There's glue lamps in there. It's exposed material. So, that kind of set us up for, okay, now how do we still distinguish between these two elements? And so we were looking at a variety of materials. Metal siding pretty quickly rose to the top because it is economical. I think it was cost competitive to painted hardy panel at that time.
Mm.
And, as an architect who doesn't do a lot of multifamily, hardy panel is a hard choice for us. It's kind of hard to tell in a way. Like the joints are really hard to get right. There's architects out there who can do it and do a beautiful job, but it's a really hard thing to pull off. And the other thing we liked about the metal siding is it was more durable. You can't kick through it. And it's something that the client's not going to have to paint. I mean, every building has maintenance, but this is a relatively low maintenance thing. So we were able to work within the confines of the AEP span catalog to pick a couple different profiles, right? So the lower spaces are more of a traditional corrugated panel. We were able to use their color vintage, which is it's the one color they have that has a little life to it. It's like almost like a clear coat, like a car clear coat. So it catches light in different ways, and that felt appropriate for that scale. Um, and then we did a standing seam metal roof that was complementary color. And then when we went to the warehouse, we flipped to a much darker, and you can kind of see it in the photos, that much darker metal, different profile siding, different scale. And that really helped accentuate between the two. And then, tying it together were the windows. We found there's a window company that I believe they're manufactured mostly in Poland. They may be also making them in Mexico now, Igloo. And they make a European style extrusion, so much more durable and beefier. They were able to offer it in some colors. It's phthalate free, so that was a bonus if you're going to use PVC, which is a hard choice for us as architects, but that was where this budget went. So we had those. We had a little bit of storefront at the entry where we sort of put that in where we needed more glazing. And then kind of accenting around the building are some Kebony, which is a perforated wood product that we use that does not need a finish. And then there's a couple of punches of color that we literally just bought 1/8-inch aluminum, custom fabbed it, and had it kind of coated. And then the kind of last component to all that is that entry pergola, which is a custom steel piece that we spent quite a bit of time designing. And, we put our effort in there because that's the first impression clients get.
Well, it was genius, really. I have to say first that I was sitting here going, where in the hell did they lay down the panels to tilt them up? Or where did they think they were? Where did they think they were? It's been quite a few years since I did a tilt up project, but earlier in my career, I did a lot of schools, and a bunch of those schools were tilt up. And you got a big, huge field that's eventually going to become soccer fields or playgrounds or whatever. Lots of room, and I'm like, you're going to tilt up where? But I think it's a testament to your planning that you also thought about the maintenance, because it's going to be an issue for a nonprofit if it's a difficult maintenance. Metal siding probably takes less than a lot of things. So that's going to make it more cost effective for them in the long run, especially since this is their home. They're not going anywhere. They're staying here for the long run.
Exactly.
I've been waiting to get to this question because I always read the project description first that I get, and sometimes I go further than that, and I go troll you on the internet and see what else I can, newspaper articles or whatever, and then I look at the pictures. So I saw the food bank market, as I was reading through. So I'm just figuring in that this is some little space that that's where they stack the food, and then they pull stuff off the workers and hand it to somebody. And then I go look at the pictures, and it's a full-blown grocery store. I mean, it appears to be a full-grown grocery store. Tell me about that. And what made you go there? Or is this something that they already wanted? I think it's fantastic, but it was not what I expected to see. So tell me how you got to this, what looks like a grocery store I shop in all the time. I mean, it does. It looks just like the store I walk into. I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, so I'll say the food bank as a client came to us with that agenda that they wanted this to feel, they were going from a model where they were space challenged. And I think they would let like one person in at a time and they would go around and grab their stuff and volunteers would maybe hand them stuff and then they'd like bag it up and go. Right. And they really wanted to move to in their ideal heart of hearts, it would simply be a space where you'd just like you and I, we don't walk in the front door of our grocery store, get a ticket, and sit down and wait around with a cup of stale coffee, right? To go in before we can shop. Like we walk in, and that's what they wanted it to be. They really wanted it to be. You walked in, you went straight in, you went shopping, and the only difference at your checkout stand is there was no cash register, right? Like that was their vision, and it's something that at least a lot of food banks here, and there's a lot of really great work happening in the Pacific Northwest now. And I'm aware of a few others in town that are beautiful, I mean, beautiful food banks, right? That come to the fore about a way of, it's about treating people with dignity, right? That again, that thing that like, because you need help doesn't mean you should be treated differently when you get your food. And so we were willing to go right there with them, right? Based on our experience. And we had designed a number of these sort of larger 25,000 square foot supermarkets with PCC. We had done a number of smaller markets in town. Um, and we also had this kind of hospitality vibe. And so we were able to kind of think about how you efficiently lay out the rows. We understood, how to efficiently have space between two sets of shelving. Like you have to have two carts go, past each other, right? Like you shouldn't have to wait at the end of the aisle. We understood how end caps work, like they're enticing, so you're marketing food. It's where the food bank can market maybe more nutritious things. There's produce style cases. And there's also an area that I believe they still call it no cook. And they're like prepared foods, right, are especially valuable to someone that is without a home, right, where they don't have a place to cook, right? But they're also super popular. I mean, like you and I go in and if we don't feel like cooking, we go get those things to the supermarket, right? And
Right.
so but they have limited resources. So they needed a way to control that, but they also didn't want it to feel like it was rationed out. So we created almost like a deli window. You'll see in the corner of that space where it's staffed with people, there's an interaction. And so people who really needed that could get that element. And then you kind of wind your shopping cart through, and you could pull up to a check stand, which was designed around all the ergonomics of a typical check stand, with the only difference being that after you load your stuff onto the table, and volunteers help you load that into your bag, that you don't pay anything. Like there's no credit card machine
Right.
or anything, and that was it. It was very intentional. I think the other thing that I have not mentioned to date is we had a really amazing environmental graphics and branding firm working with us in this, Studio Matthews, and they were engaged separately by the food bank to help them think about the rebrand. Again, this is Jen Musée, the executive director, thinking this is an inflection part for our organization. We're spending X millions of dollars on a new home. We should also really understand who our values are and how we communicate it. So they built a branding suite that is still in their website on their food bank. It's their logo. But they also did all those big exterior signage. And then they did that beautiful mural that's on the inside of that space that spans two walls. We kind of coordinated with them to uplight it. And then we wainscoted the entire space with plywood. We can get into the reasons for that later, but then they seized on that to do this fun little clipboard thing, which I'm not sure it shows up in the photos, but rather than having like notices taped up everywhere, they came up with this fun way of like having these built-in clipboard clips attached to the plywood with an outline on it. And so I was fully integrated into the thing. So it's this complete kind of branded environment that you'd expect of a supermarket. Super fun to work on.
Is there, and I may just be missing it in the pictures I'm looking at, but I'm assuming there's also refrigerated areas?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So at the far end of the space, when you walk in the front door, there's some reach-in freezers, and then there's sort of like a produce style refrigerated cases.
Okay.
And then in the back of house, there are these massive walk-in coolers and freezers. We're able to leverage one of those. If you think about like a dairy case in a supermarket, those aren't individual refrigerators. That's a giant walk-in that has doors facing out, and they jam the shelves up against it, so you can't see what's going on there. But if you look through, you'll see people
Yeah.
stocking stuff. So we're able to leverage something like that for that no cook zone. So the refrigeration required for that doesn't require a separate refrigerator, and they just reach in to a door that goes into the walk-in.
Nice. Earlier, you gave me a broad description of the building and spaces. Can you now go into a couple of the prominent interior spaces in more detail and just describe some of the features?
Yeah. Well, I think we already hit the market pretty hard
Yeah.
here. So we'll
Yeah, we
leave that
did.
one out and say we've talked enough about that one. Um, I think the front entry and cafe is an interesting space. It's underneath one of the gables. Um, there was an interesting argument early on with the construction manager, one of the few we had, about if you look at there's a subtle curve to the ceiling where it meets its min radius. And we just thought it was really important. It hid some structure, it gave a little grace, it created just a little something extra. And finally, the contractor's like, "Oh my god, guys, it's not a big deal. We just put some plywood gusouts and make it happen." But so anyway, it's a long story to say that we fall for these little details, right? So there's this, roof, big generous slope roof. There's some skylights that balance the light. There's some window spacing for one of the raised stormwater gardens. There's a sort of eating counter against that window, so people can sit there read a book and with a cup of coffee, look out into the landscape. Um, the front desk itself was a partial donation from another local contractor that we work with. And so, Wilcox built the whole thing. But Dovetail, who's typically wouldn't work on a project like this, their shop was in the neighborhood and they give to an organization every year. And so they helped us build this front desk, which are these 3 modules. Uh, the original idea was that you could unclick them, roll them away. So they had to be designed that way. Truth be told, I don't think I've ever been there when they've rolled them away for an event, but it's possible. Um, but it was sort of bringing this sort of very high-end kind of commercial thing to this one moment where you enter. Um, and my favorite part of that uh, is that we had learned during design that one of the groups that drops off food every week is Trader Joe's, and apparently they just always have excess flowers, and they never know what to do with the flowers. We said, let's design this beautiful built-in stainless vase insert that you can put your flowers in. And so we did that. And I remember showing up the first day and there was a glass vase of flowers sitting next to the vase. I said, "Hey, get the vase." Oh. And so every time I show up there, they have a beautiful floral arrangement in that thing. And they took it one step further. And that was sort of an inspiration for them. So when you come in every morning, a volunteer has taken fresh cut flowers and set them on every one of the cafe tables. And it's just this lovely moment to where they're leveraging something they had that wasn't necessarily being used or taken to make this feel like a really special place for everyone. And so I love that. And then the cafe is a pretty typical commercial kitchen. It's basic, but we designed it with a kitchen equipment designer to make it super flexible. The cafe space feels like a cafe space. And then, the hub is a very basic space, 3 small offices that they could do private consultations, a larger space that's more flexible. And then the offices have the thing offices have, right? Where there's like a couple of private offices, a larger space for open officing, a small conference room.
I have to ask again. I'm going down a rabbit hole. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Um, so you're also free to say no. I don't want to answer that. Um, How much, so you've said 2 things as we've been talking. We've talked about having the contractor on board early while you were designing and being able to work through some things. And then you've also talked about how you see how somebody has made a space their own once a building's done, how they've done these little things, like those clips. And how much do both of those things, I imagine you learn a lot from both of those interactions. How much does that influence the next project you're working on? When you see somebody using an area maybe differently than you would have thought or adding something to it, does that influence a design element on the next project when you think, well, they did this over here and I could just design that in?
Yeah. Every single project, right? You come back later. Um, I don't know. I stalk my projects. So I try to come back and see them and I see what's happened. And, sometimes it just, I'm disappointed in my client for doing X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah.
But more often than not, I'm sort of shocked and delighted at what they've been able to do. And or I learned something about the materials we've chosen or the layout that didn't maybe work so well that they're now struggling with, right? I think a good example of that would be something that we actually learned from a previous project that we applied to the Ballard Food Bank, which, God, my team always laughs at me because I always establish a department of corner guards on every project now. Um, because if you have a shopping cart, it will find the soft underbelly of your architecture every single time. And that's something we learned on the PCC project, where also what you learn is every single shopping cart has a different outside corner, different height, different location, right? It hits things in different places. And so when we were doing early work with that client, we had done the branding. We were getting ready to start design on a full ground up, and they said, "Well, we're doing this renovation to this deli. Let's do some mock-ups." So we redesigned this deli, and me and the project architect went afterward, and the client said, "Here, hand us a couple shopping carts. Go for it." And so we're like, "Oh God!" And we're rolling around like banging it into our architecture, and we're like, "Okay, that worked. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, that worked. That didn't work." And so when you look at the food bank, you'll see a lot of these sort of bits of solid metal around the building, and they're decorative, right? This gets back to leveraging the needs into the architecture, but you'll find those pieces everywhere. And I will say that when I go back there, I see where we missed again, and that's applied to the next project, right? I see where things got constricted, right? To like the front door has become a bottleneck for them, and the next food bank it's much wider. So there's stuff like that that you learn, and I think as architects, that's the joy. Is like if you're just like a little bit humble about what you do, you keep on learning.
Well, I know so many times I've seen architects go out for the grand opening, but not really go back and like spend some time there. While it's whatever the building is, it doesn't matter. While it's up and running and watching how everybody lives, works, and plays in that space. And I think those are some of the best lessons. You're not going to get everything on every project every time. Something's going to be an average idea that turns out to be amazing, or it's going to be a great idea that turned out to not work so well. But you don't know that if you don't spend some time there. And so I just love that you were talking about, you know, learning from how they were using different parts of the space, and also being just humble enough to listen to the input from your contractor who actually has to build it. Because it's another area I think we could improve on the design side. Um, Although I'm sure that I've seen more than one headbutt over over things like that. But
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's the earlier version of me didn't understand that, right? We
right,
talked way at the beginning of the podcast, uh, learning that you can learn from folks, but then also knowing when you're like, yeah, I know it's more difficult to build it, but that's important to the project, right? And so
right.
striking that balance with the contractor is, yeah, I think is huge.
So you mentioned materials. So let's talk about material choices a little bit. I have found that when architects have a really tight budget, where you really have to be conscious of every dollar you spend, I've seen architects get really creative with some of the most average materials. Because obviously, especially for a nonprofit, you're really watching, you want something to be durable, you want it to last so they
Hmm.
don't have to replace it, but you also want to give them all the best bang for their buck. Tell
Yeah.
me about some of the materials, just a couple of unique materials you used or normal materials you used in a unique way on the inside of this building to get to where you needed to go.
Yeah. So I would be hard pressed to describe any of the materials themselves as unique, right? So I think it was
Okay.
more understanding where we would deploy what, because I think you hit the nail on the head for a lot of these smaller nonprofit projects. Your budget suggests that you're going to be painted drywall, um, level 4 if you're lucky, um, rubber base and POM. And I think that was not something we wanted to deliver as a project to this client. And so what we realized though is like, yeah, a lot of it's going to be painted sheetrock. Like, we're not going to try to spread our efforts evenly across this. We have to find a place where we can, where is the best place to leverage the expense. And so in the supermarket, right, we picked a wood structure system that would be the finish, right? So you get this warmth of the ceiling. We spent a bunch of money on daylighting. We worked early with there's a daylighting group as part of integrated design lab at the University of Washington that we got a little lightweight of ice from them, but just enough to kind of daylight the space, and that was important. And then the rest of the interiors, we polished the concrete, which is a relatively inexpensive and super bomber kind of material for the floor. And then, I had mentioned Department of Corner Guards, right? So you look around, and we did 2B mill scale stainless. So stainless out of the mill, if it's under 1/4 inch, is kind of got this shiny plasticky look. That out of the mill, once it gets over 1/4 inch, it has a roller marks and grain marks like hot rolled steel does. And so if you just use it, just straight out of the box, you don't try to polish it, you get this character, which we're able to apply to corners, the front counter, some of the materials in that front desk use that same material as well. And then a lot of the casework is Baltic birch plywood. It's a relatively inexpensive plywood. We worked the casework to make sure it wasn't like this, the lines that get pretty wild, right? So we were able to work with them to kind of select out a little bit of that, but otherwise keep it pretty basic with a clear finish. The edges are exposed sort of multiply edges, so they don't have to worry about edge banding. We applied plastic laminate on wear surfaces, on shelving to kind of make them a bit more durable, right? So all those minor choices. And then, in that warehouse, there's that wainscoting that we talked about as well that also are like, well, it comes in 4x8 sheets. Our wainscoting will be no taller than 8 feet, right? So they can just put the panels up between the windows, right? And so really just thinking about, how this stuff comes together, how it gets built, what's the most efficient way to use it, and how do we have real durable natural materials with character.
Well, that's also a good point about thinking about how it gets built. I mean, that can totally affect your materials might be cost effective, but if you're using twice as much labor to put together some difficult
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
detailing and not thinking about those things ahead of time so you can install it as efficiently as possible, then that cost effective material doesn't really mean anything because now you've made it cost a whole lot more by a difficult installation procedure. I will tell you, it does not look cheap. I saw the wood ceilings I just saw a lot of things that I'm like, wow, this is just for a food bank, for what I would picture a food bank to look like. This is already off the rails, but it looks so warm and inviting and doesn't look like someone had to sit and pick the cheapest material of everything that's out there, which would have been my anticipation before I looked at the pictures of what I would expect to see at a food bank. So kudos to you, by the way. Tell me about at least one design challenge that you faced on this project and how you solved it.
Well, can I get real technical and geeky on this one? Is that okay? All
Absolutely.
right. So, as a project leader on any given project, I have at least one and sometimes 2 or 3 details that keep me up at night. And it's like the thing that I'm super nervous about. And it might, it's different on every project. On this one, the seesaw roof that we had, um, they're the valleys. And the valleys have to, we can't cricket and pour water against the adjacent warehouse building. We have to direct all the water to the outside. We have to get the water to a rainwater garden, and we have to have these things not leak, right? It's like we're gathering water in a big concentrated spot above there. And so, thankfully we had a good envelope consultant, a very talented young architect in my office named Erica Wichter was working with us, and she was just dogged at figuring this out. And we sort of ended up with a hybrid system where those gutters are membrane and you can't kind of see them from the street, but they're fairly wide. We figured out how to locate drains so that we could do the 1/4 inch for slope within those without making them too deep or the thing too wide. And it's this complicated set of details, but it's just like you turn to one sheet in our set and there's several axons of how this all comes together and how the rainwater comes off the end. And then there are several like almost, half-page details of the waterproofing in this zone. And, knock on something, it seems to have worked out pretty well. But that was, I think for me, that was the pain point. I mean, there was all sorts of other things, challenges on the project. But the rest of it, sort of resolved itself through just sort of thoughtful detailing, right? But that was the one area where for a while there, it was a little touch and go.
Well, one thing when I'm talking to young professionals that I can't stress enough to them is don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call the people who know. Maybe it's the product manufacturer and tell them, hey, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. This is what I have to make happen. Do you have any suggestions? Because nobody knows their products as well as they do. Or calling that consultant, like you said, you had a great building envelope consultant. Calling that consultant and, I'm doing this other thing and I know I'm designing this, but hey, can you give me a little advice here? This part's, giving me gray hair. It goes a long way to getting where you need to go and not staying awake half the night stressing about it, which
Yeah,
would be
it's
what I
funny.
would do.
Yeah, I think it's a generational thing, but getting some of the younger staff to actually pick up a phone is, you'll hear, oh, I emailed them, I haven't heard back. I'm like, did you call them? But once you pick up the phone, you realize, oh, these people know a ton. They're so full of information. Like, I mean, there are bad product reps out there too, who
Yeah,
are mostly
absolutely.
sales, but the ones who know their product, I mean, as an architect, there's some products out there, and like standard 4.5-inch center set storefronts one, right, where there's 6 manufacturers. I'm going to spec the one that has the good local product rep that knows their product and that can offer support. Um, and so I think having those people available to you is hugely important. And then, also knowing that there are resources out there, and telling young architects that like there's this book called SMACTA, and they look at you and they're like, "Back what?" Like SMACTA. You pull up this big silver book and you're like, "Here." I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea.
Yeah. I'm gonna smack you if you don't read it. We could have some fun with that. I found the younger professionals are, they were raised different than we are, but you give them that little guidance and get them to make that first phone call. And once they've made that first phone call, they never stop making those phone calls because they figure out, wow, this conversation gets this done in 30 minutes instead of 12 hours and 10 days with 100 emails back and forth. um, I mean, that's what we're here to do is guide and mentor them and help them and let them help us because they have as much to offer us as we do to them, just from a different standpoint. But we also have to be approachable enough that we can have that give and take and explore these ideas. And unfortunately for us who have been around a while, um, and the tiny size of Gen X, we are all working pretty hard. And you really have to make a conscious effort to find time to mentor the ginormous group of young people coming behind us. And that's hard to do sometimes, because the boomers are leaving and we're filling their shoes and we're a tiny group. There's not enough of us to fill those shoes, but yet that means we need a bunch of these younger people to step up sooner. We can't afford to not find that time for them. It's challenging. Don't get me started on mentorship. We'll have a whole nother episode talking about that. So some of the best lessons learned I have found throughout the course of my career, if it makes it back to me, are issues that come up during construction. I don't like the word issues, challenges that come up during construction. Uh, where your design's becoming a reality and whoa, something's not going to work. Tell me about one unexpected challenge you faced during construction on this building and how you solved it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in the scheme of, however many projects I've built in my career and the sort of range of like, I barely had to show up for CA to like, this was a slog the whole way. I feel like I had to show up for CA, don't get me wrong. And we had our challenges, but it felt like we had a really good contractor and a good super is just worth their weight in gold. And we had a great super. And he and his team was looking ahead, was able to identify issues mostly before they came up. It was rare we were standing in the field looking at an UPSI. And so I think things went relatively well. I would say that the thing that was challenging for us uniquely on this project was that it was being built during a COVID-19 epidemic. And I'm sure you've heard this on other, from other architects working on the podcast. Every project probably has its COVID-19 story that was built in the 2021. We had a number of supply chain issues. I think the one that's most memorable had to do with orange paint. And you see the orange in the building. It was a brand color that they had come up with CDO Matthews. It was a very particular Pantone color that we were like, look, we're going to put orange in the building. It's a Pantone color. So we had matched that for some of those Kynar finished panels that are between windows. And it was time to get the paint, to do the paint drawdowns and the paint for the pergola structure, which was, that was all shot prime steel, but it had to be all welded and put in place and was going to be field painted. And got a call from the contractor saying, we can't get the paint. I'm like, well, you can't get the paint. He's like, well, apparently, I did not know this, is that the overwhelming majority of pigments used by the U.S. paint manufacturing process are manufactured in Houston. And it was just after that huge hurricane that devastated Houston. And so there was this one red pigment that was in the overwhelming majority of orange paint that was simply not available. And it was certainly not available. Like we were using a Tnemic product at the time. That was the original spec. It was a high performance paint product. Their supplier couldn't get the paint. So then, it was us as architects calling every paint rep we knew who provided a high performance 3-part paint spec. And I believe we ended up with a Sherwin-Williams product, but don't quote me on that, where they're like, well, we can't really get any red pigments now, but in the quantities you need for your project, here, like of the 5 oranges you asked about in our line, these 2 we can get. And so we were literally sitting there going like, okay, can we live with this orange? Can we not with that orange? And finally, like, we were like, okay, it's go time. And like they grabbed the last 6 buckets of paint from the warehouse and we got the thing painted, but we were ready to be like, hey, Food Bank, you need to rebrand again. So that was just a bizarre thing I've never encountered before.
I just by nature of when we started this podcast, I have heard quite a few how we navigated COVID during construction stories. I have never heard one about not being able to get paint at in any situation, not just COVID. So that's pretty interesting. But you got it done.
Yeah.
But there's another good example. Talk to your product reps. They can work miracles on occasion when you need them to.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So what did you learn from this project that will make you a better architect on the next project?
Well, I think I mentioned before, we learn on every project. I think, if I have to go back to it, we talked about earlier in the podcast here about the value of a strong client, right? And I still occasionally have coffee or we go out for a beer with me and the executive director because what's sprouted up around them is this amazing brewery district. So it's easy to go meet her for a beer. But we talk, and it's that relationship with that client that I that I value so much because I realized that she brought such strength to creating an organization that knew who they were and how important that is for you to, as an architect, to design something for a client that feels like it fits the client and feels their needs, right? Like we could have designed a food bank that would have looked different if we didn't know what they exactly wanted. We can design a restaurant that way. And sometimes we have to, right? Sometimes we have
Yeah.
clients that don't, but the value of a good client or and it could be also the value in taking that knowledge of what makes a good client and educating other clients, right? To explain to them like, well, hey, you need to be able to communicate before we get started here, who you are, what you value, what's important, what do you want to communicate, right? And then we'll translate that to architecture and being able to sort of more clearly articulate that to clients that come to us has been huge.
It's funny because as I was listening to you talk, my next question was going to be, so are you going to communicate that to future clients? I mean, seeing how much that influenced this project and them going to that effort, um, it would, and that's exactly what you said you're going to do is, and like you said, not every client's going to be able to manage that, but some clients might really appreciate just a little guidance that, oh wow, if we do these things before we sit down, we might start off on a much better foot. We might get to where we need to go faster. So before we get to our closing questions, I said it already. I was really excited to have your firm back on the show. What are you working on at Grand Baba now that I get to hear about in the future
Uh,
that
I
you can
think,
tell me about?
yeah. No, fair enough. Thankfully, I don't have many NDA projects at the moment. Um, I'd say one of the things I that drew me to Grand Baba many years ago, long before I was an owner, was the diversity of the work, right? So at any given time, we're working on a lot of different things. So, at the moment, I just wrapped up an 1,100 square foot wine store, but I also just wrapped up a 90,000 square foot, 2 building, 34 venue cafe for a tech company, right? And there's everything in between. So right now, we mentioned we have the Vashon Food Bank, which is a food bank on an island off the coast of Seattle, reachable by ferry. So I've got that on one end. We've got a small mid-century model residential remodel. We do a lot of high-end single family, um, and public market for the city of Renton, and another one on the Vancouver, Washington waterfront. And then the one that I'm like near and dear to my heart right now that I'm most excited about is this project in Wenatchee, Washington, which is, I guess technically central Washington, but if you live in Seattle, everything east of the Cascades is Eastern Washington, right?
Right.
So it's a small, originally agricultural city. It's now a sort of small, mid-sized city in Eastern Washington. The site is at the edge of their downtown. Developer we're working with is developing a very large multifamily project. That's not our project. That's not our bailiwick, right? But when they bought their site, they inherited a quarter block site that had a bunch of nondescript, pretty poor shape 1920s retail structures on the main street. And hidden behind that was this little brick house. And turns out that little brick house was the original 1914 jailhouse in the city of Wenatchee. And it's 16-inch thick brick unreinforced masonry walls, concrete floor and ceiling. Um, if you look carefully at the window openings, you see little metal flat bar tabs where the jail bars used to be. It's in pretty rough shape. But they came to us committed to say that. And they said, we're going to tear everything else down. Just tell us what to do with the jail. And we're like, well, wait a second. Let's leverage the whole site. And so where we're at now, we're in CDs. The jail is being restored. The ground floor is going to they have a potential tenant that I think is going to be a deli / charcuterie place. The upper level is going to be a speakeasy. That's connected to a very contemporary brick and steel building that we're designing next to it. There's a glass bridge that connects it over. Interesting, there used to be a bridge where we're putting our bridge that used to connect this jail to the old courthouse that's no longer there. That was called the Bridge of Sighs. So it's still getting that name. And And so that building will have a pair of restaurants in it, we think. Um, that one's brick on the ground floor, sort of proportions to match the rest of downtown Wenatchee, but copper and butt glazed curtain wall on top, this beautiful room on top with a terrace overlooking the water. Um, and then on the other side of the site, a little bit more retail, another temporary brick building, and then a garden space that we're designing with a landscape architect. There'll be a new public plaza. So it's just this fun, like it has all the things, right?
Yeah.
Which is super fun. And we're really excited. It's like, it's really actually going to happen.
It's those projects that help us get through the square box projects, right? Interesting challenges and new things to work with. So I always close every episode with 2 closing questions, the first being a more broad industry question. So I went and like I mentioned before, I trolled you a little bit online on the internet and spotted that you recently did a presentation for Architects Without Borders um, for their food equity series. So tell me a little bit about that and why it's important.
Yeah. So Architects Without Borders, Seattle, has done a lot of international work, but they're now also focusing a little bit more on local community work and helping local communities. And it's an organization that we, as a firm, give money to. We were volunteering for a project right now to help a church that is been an immigrant sort of center. We're helping them renovate their kitchens. So we've done work with them. We have a relationship with them. And they were doing this series, and is because there's a lot of architects in Seattle doing really great work in food equity. We're not the only ones. And so I think it felt really important for us to show up and share our work. These other firms are sharing their work. And so it was important to kind of get that word out there. It's always, whenever you do work, it's nice to be able to talk about it, regardless of what it is. But in this case, sort of sharing our work together to help us, like, they can learn from this project. I can learn from their projects. We don't always have to learn from our own mistakes.
Well, I like that most architects, if they have an opportunity, will go present and share their project. And it's typically at an AIA meeting or some design thing. I like that you took it to a group of architects who are actually working specifically to make good change and to share that knowledge and help each other. So no matter what anybody is working on, just like I hope when my listeners hear this episode, they'll run to their desk to go change something based on something you said today, or give them an idea to help some community organization they're involved with. It does make a difference, especially if you share that knowledge and that process in a group that can take it somewhere else and do something with it. So, final question. This is the easiest one of the day. That was
Usually that prefaces the hardest question of the day, but let's see how this goes.
Yeah. So you figured out my sarcasm already. Okay. So, I'm especially loving this. I close every episode with this question, but I'm especially loving it today. We all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. At least I hope we all do. So, personal or professional, what do you hope your impact will be?
Yeah. So it's been an interesting question. So I joined the firm in 2013. I've been doing this much longer than that, and I became a partner in 2020. And one of the questions that kind of I started asking myself is, what do I want to do with my time at the firm, and what do I want? How do I want to help shape the firm as a leader? And I think for me, it, it's doing projects that are impactful to other people. And that maybe is pretty broad, but that you're making change, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean it's a food bank project or it's a non-for-profit, right? Like I look at the tech cafeteria that we did, and the cafeteria is underselling it. So it's like a hospitality like space for those employees. And tens of thousands of those employees are going to go through every day. And they're going to have a better day because of it. right? Like they're going to, it feels like a kind of space that's going to make them feel better about what they do. Now, I don't have to trace that through to kind of, that being done because this company wants to retain the best and brightest so they could, rule the world. Like but if I step back from that, think about the people that are actually impacted and what our client was trying to do there is making a better place for their employees. Like that feels impactful for me. And so if I can do that there in the public sphere in some of these public markets, like really sort of change a community, be transformational in the way people spend their time, that these are people-centered spaces, then, if I look back on a body of work like that, I'm going to feel pretty good about my retirement.
Well, I don't blame you, and I think that that's a great goal. I mean, that tech company, I have friends and have had friends who have worked in that industry, maybe even for that company, and they work hard. They long hours, very focused work, and having a space that doesn't feel like the office for a little bit, even if it's just to go have some lunch or disconnect. And I've noticed I toured. I had a good friend of mine I've known since she was born, actually, who worked for Microsoft in their Xbox division. And this was years ago, but she made arrangements for me to bring my, at that time, 11-year-old son to tour Xbox with her. And I can't talk about anything I saw, but even all these years later, I know better.
No, I know, right?
But I will say that I was blown away in walking around at how well they took care of their people and the spaces that they provided for them, and how much thought they put into, you are not just a worker, you are a human. And it does make a difference. It makes a difference for people every single day. So I think that's a pretty good impact.
Yeah. And I'd say, like, from our perspective, that particular client, there was a kind of generosity of spirit that we were getting from our client that makes us want to do those projects. And, doesn't, what it exactly is, being matter less than the motivations that were being imparted to us. That felt very positive.
Well, doing good feels good. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today on Detailed. Always happy to have Grandbaba in the house, and you are always welcome. So you don't wait for an invite. You have another great project. We'd love to have you back.
We've enjoyed being on these podcasts, so we'll definitely let you know.
You guys are keepers. Thanks.